All right. Just double check the recording. I believe I am recording. Woo woo. All right. So today we're going to talk about the influence of communication on. All right. Maybe I should restart that. Thought just went away. We're going to be talking about cultural influence on communication. And a lot of just kind of defining what. So coming up with definitions. And a lot of how does this influence communication is what I want you to be thinking about. Like, how do these concepts and definitions that we're considering today, how does that influence communication? And remember, way back to like class 1, where there was that statement saying that most of communication is misunderstanding. We misunderstand each other. So how do these concepts connect to understanding each other? And so first I want to talk about social constructionism. So social constructionism is a view that argues the self is formed throughout our interactions with others in our relationship to social, cultural, and political contexts. And so what's that saying? And you may have heard of the argument, is it nature versus nurture? How does that form your personality? What social constructionism says is it's nature. It's the things we interact, it's the experiences we have that form who we are, not only with ourselves, but also within the context of others. So let's pretend you had an exact twin and we took that exact twin and put them in a household that had no money, that was in a bad neighborhood. Social constructionism says that exact twin is going to end up completely different from you. That the experiences you undergo are going to create how you react, both internally and how you react to society. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, is these labels that we either decide for ourselves to have, or society places them upon us. And one of those is race. So what we really want to talk about with race is that race is a social construction. It's made up. There's no biological, you are this race or that race. Now we have traits that we collect people into. So those are what are known as phenotypes. All right. So they're way biological, like your genes and your DNA present to others. Genotype would be the opposite of that, of like, that's actually in your genes. That's actually who you are. But phenotype is what we generally see when we're talking about race. Someone has darker skin, someone has certain features. And so throughout history, different categories of people have been considered races based on how they look, not on any genetic connection, not on any biology other than appearance, and then even confusion between that. So my father often gets confused for Middle Eastern. But he's from Mexico, born and raised. So people see things differently than we actually are, and that's usually how race is created, because then it allows people that get to make those decisions to create hierarchies or rankings of what is better and what is not. And as an example, so this is actually a chart throughout history, or the US history, I should say. So like, if race is a thing, right? If it's a biological concept, back in the 1800s, or back in the late 1700s, there was no category for race. And this is based on like the census, the US Census. So they want to count people and get other data information. And in the 1790s, they're like, I don't know, person's person. In the 1800s, then they started defining race. And it was based on the amount of African blood in you. So they start making these designations, like if you're from a place and you have that percentage of place in you, then you're a certain race. And so there was this word mulatto, which was someone who had one parent that was black and one parent that was white. A quadroon, you had 1/4 African blood, and an octoroon was 1/8. And so these started defining in policy and terms what race was, and it was different language than we use now. And even early back then, for almost a century, instead of saying race, the term was color, like because these judgments were being made upon appearance. So let's go ahead, like let's even think about like the 1950s. The term color was then replaced by race. So the people in charge decided color, we're not going to say that, it's race. Largely because they were trying to like scientifically apply the concept, saying that there was a difference between different people. And in the 60s and 70s, race and color were used in government forms. In 1980s, color was dropped to using race. And it was only kind of recent, 2 decades ago, that individuals were allowed to choose more than one category. And about a decade ago, the government started realizing that there was more than just the categories they had, and gave options for people to identify as something that wasn't confined or conformed to what the government considered race. So there's this concept, and I believe we've talked about it before, this concept of code switching. So code switching is when you are from a certain cultural background, and what gets considered race, but you realize you have to act differently. And so you change from one way of speaking to another. And a lot of that's because people react and will assign you, in their perspective, assign you to a particular race based on the way you speak. So as a adaptation to the expectations from others, those from the minority populations do what's called code switching, and that's just really altering the way you speak, the way you dress, in order to fit into the dominant culture and to find some kind of level of acceptance. Now, gender also has bias that goes along with it. And with gender, there's a lot of confusion with words and word choices. So sex refers to biology, okay, and even beyond physical way that presents physically, sex is what your chromosomes are. So males have 2 X chromosomes in the genes, and females have XY, and that's what sex refers to. Gender is a social construction. It is both how we identify personally and how society puts us into these categories of this is what you are or this is what you're not. So sex is biological, gender is social. Now, when we were talking about gender, there's a concept of the patriarchy. And what the patriarchy is, again, socially constructed. For millennium, rules, regulations, customs have been male-oriented. And so if you give any population over thousands and thousands of years the ability to say what's normal and what's not, there's a lot of control and a lot of power in that. And so what the patriarchy refers to is the male dominance in culture and the ability to create rules and standards and what a community and society deems normal. And so, and we talked about this last class with the same concept of even just white supremacy and the idea of even when someone isn't what we consider or might imagine when we hear white supremacist, the idea that society revolves around that identity and identifies and unidentifies in relation to that, in relation to whiteness. It's very similar with gender and the patriarchy. we define female roles, both what they do and what they don't do, or how they act or don't act, in relation to male expectations. So you can start seeing a little bit in that of how that might affect communication. So that's, or actually, I thought we were at the end. So we're also, there's a term transgender, and it's an umbrella term. And transgender is just anything that identifies or expresses itself not aligned with their sex. So trans means across gender, so just across genders. And this could be anything from someone who's transsexual, transvestite. Again, if you think of this in terms of the patriarchy, there's a whole new definition that has to be created because it doesn't fit into what's considered normal or standard. And there's a lot of resistance to these ideas. Right now, it's very popular to kind of go against the usage of pronouns. Why should people use pronouns? There should only be two identifications. Well, how does that affect communication if someone feels they don't fall into those two communications? So kind of seeing how that sets up against norms and power structures, and how language has to adjust for those items. So sexual orientation refers to a person's, and I'm deleting primary here, I don't like that, but just essentially who someone's attracted to, or different people that are attracted to. So sexual orientations and how people view the world on that it runs so much further. I know we usually say heterosexual, homosexual. There are so many other classifications and categorizations. So again, it falls back to, how does that affect communication? How do we address it? Do we address it? So if you were talking to someone with a different sexual orientation, does it enter the conversation? Does it not? Is it only in certain contexts that it would? And how do you approach it? So this is a very long list too, but kind of similarly how we were talking about race and how it was used differently over time. This is just a history of how sexual orientation was viewed over time. And we can start off 1400 BCE, where the Greeks and Roman era, and there was no conception of sexual identity. You just did what you did, and people kind of minded their own business. So now we fast forward a couple of millennia, and we're in 2011, and it was a big deal that this policy got passed in the army called "Don't Ask, Don't Tell," and it was repealed because it was a policy that said you can be gay, you just can't let anybody know you're gay. And so repealing it said, no, you should just be allowed to serve. Like, your sexuality isn't the government's business. And so you can see the change through thousands of years on there, and the different responses in different centuries, because there's just a myriad of change in that. And we're still going through that. So the medical model of disability is when someone physically, emotionally has what gets termed a disability, but from a medical perspective. So gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, these are all socially constructed identities. This is probably the only identity that actually has some medical backing to it. But in reaction to that, there's a concept called ableism. And ableism is a system of belief that produces a standardization. So people should be this way physically, mentally, emotionally, and anything against it gets treated as abnormal, and you should be able to, you shouldn't have equal treatment. So a lot of times someone in a wheelchair may say someone who runs and expects the person in the wheelchair to run is an ableist, or someone that says, well, there shouldn't be ramps. That's ableism. So thinking that there's this perfect physicalness that everyone should be and then expecting everyone to be defined by those terms. So just like we've shown, even in this terms, we can see throughout history how things have changed. And 400 before the Christian era, the Greeks were making connections. They kind of had rudimentary science going on, and they saw the connection between biology, physiology, and actions. And so they saw that epilepsy wasn't a disorder of the mind, but they were still saying, "Oh, that's kind of some kind of spiritual punishment or spiritual affect." And a lot of actually leaders like Caesars had epilepsy, so there was also some kind of component of like, "Oh, well, if you have epilepsy, you must be superior." Now we go to 1990, and the American Disabilities Act is passing Congress and signed into law. So this was just in 1990. That's not all that far ago. So it really, until then, it was sorry, deal with it. So really, we're still in a vast movement for equality for all these categories. Again, social constructions. As a society, we've made up these categories. We're still trying to create some form of equality for people across these categories. So we've got 3 questions for you, and I really want you to give these some consideration. We'll talk about them in the next class when we get together, but I just want you to take a moment and look around right now. Take in what's happening where you're at, and remember we talked about this concept of salience. So if you have to look it up, give it a good Google search, look it up. What is salient for you right now as you look around, and why? And then think about the 3 components of salience. What of those 3 components is standing out to you, and why? So just take a moment, take in your surroundings, and think about what you're seeing going on around you. And then, we also talked about organizing information. And we simplify and categorize information into patterns and categories and ways of understanding for us, so that we can have a concept of understanding and that we can understand quickly. So there's that word heuristics. So I think about some cases in which you think that quickly categorizing is beneficial, and when would it cause harm? So remember, there's far more information available and that you're taking in than you can process. So how do these shortcuts benefit us, and how do they harm us in the way we see the world? And then finally, I want you to think about, we talked about schematics, and it put it in the framework of like a blueprint. How do you make blueprints for information mentally when you're processing, or how you go about your life? So what is the blueprint when you come to studying? What is the blueprint that you expect when let's say a decade from now and you have a job, a career? What is the blueprint for your personal life? Like what are the quick mental like rules that you have for yourself? And what are the blueprints for you civically? So how you connect with your community. And out of all those blueprints you have for yourself, is there one that you commonly go back to and that you think you'll keep going back to? And maybe think about like how some of those have been challenged lately. Or do you see them forever being challenged? Or the blueprint you have now for life, the blueprint you see working for you throughout life? So these are just some things I want you to think about. They are kind of deep questions, so give them some good thought. And yeah, we'll talk about them a little bit when we get back together. But just wanted to go over some identities with you, and think about, how does a person in the way they identify and the way other people's identify them, because we're also being identified by others, how does that affect how someone might communicate and interact with others?